And hello, everyone again. Welcome to the University of the Underground, a free, pluralistic, and transnational university and charity founded in 2017. And my name is Naum, the head of program of I Want to Believe, a program about religion and belief systems and how they connect with society, economics, politics, and nation states. I would like to welcome our participants and our visiting participants. Welcome for being here and support the University of the Underground by donating. You can go to the website, click donate, and we appreciate this a lot so we can keep running these kind of programs. And today we have Professor Carmel Chiswick with us. Professor Chiswick is a development economist and a labor economist. She holds a PhD from Columbia University in New York, where she studied economic development and economic history. She worked as an economist at the United Nations, the World Bank, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and so on. She has an impressive track record. But what is very interesting is that her recent work focuses on the economics of religion, especially as it applies to demography, like marriage, household formation, fertility, and child caring, to religious ritual observance by both individuals and institutions, and to religious markets. So, Professor Carmel, welcome to the University of the Underground. We will have a 40-minute presentation, and then we will have some time for Q&A. So the stage is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this virtual lecture. I am not as experienced with Zoom as most of you are, so if there's any technical issue that arises, be sure to let me know, because I will not be able to detect it myself. So you may be wondering what an economist is doing studying religion. It's a new field. It's only been about 30 years since it began, and it has mushroomed because it is so interesting. And what I hope to do today is just sort of give you a taste of what that field has to contribute to our knowledge about religion, what kinds of questions it asks, and what kinds of questions it actually answers. The people, when they find out that I'm an economist, invariably ask me something about the interest rates or something about the stock market, and neither of those subjects is anything that I know anything about. When you are taking the first course in economics, they give you a very fancy definition of what the subject is, but the short answer is budgets. Everybody has budgets. Budgets means you have resources at your disposal and you have to decide how to spend them because you have more than one goal that you want to reach. Everybody has budgets, and you think about your budget all the time, even if you're not an economist. So that's the wavelength that I want to put you on right now. Think about your budgets. Now, when I say budgets, the uninitiated always think I'm talking about money, but you've got more than one budget that you have to worry about. The second budget, which is probably even more important than your money, is your time. Unlike money, where different people have different amounts of money at their disposal, we call it your income. Time is very equal, very egalitarian. We've all got 24 hours in a day, 365 days in the year, unless it's a leap year, etc. And we all have, although our lifetime may be different lengths, it's all in the same order of magnitude. You know you're not going to live forever. Now, religion, in a sense, helps you deal with this, the time question. It helps you deal with your mortality, the fact that you're not going to live forever and you need to live this life in the best way possible. And religions generally give you some goals that you of how to spend your time, or how to make the best use of the time that you have. And I guess what I want to talk about today is what some of those goals are, and how you how they how you have to work your budget, what the budgeting issues are. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, religion itself is a good. It's an economic good. And we know that the definition of an economic good is anything that you're willing to spend your resources on, your time and your money. And if you're interested in religion, which most people are one way or another to a greater or lesser degree, you have to spend time and you have to spend money and you have to just fit it into your budget, because you want to do a lot of other things also with your time and money. So we're going to talk about that, time and money. You have other budgets as well. People, when they're talking about parenting or even religion, they say, well, you've got an energy budget. There's only so much energy you can spend in a given day or a given hour. But I'm not going to talk about that now. We're just going to keep it focused on time and money. Now, if you're talking about religion as an economic good, which is the big insight that Professor Yannicone gave us about 30 years ago, then you have to, you can apply all of the laws of demand, all of the things that we already know about how consumers budget their income. You can apply those same rules to religion. So think of religion as an activity that you want to do. You have goals, and you are going to spend time and money on it, and you have to decide how to do it. Now, one of the things that we know about economic goods, demand for goods, that is to say, is if it's very expensive, you're not going to buy a lot of it, especially if you have a limited budget. But if it's very cheap, that's the kind of thing you want to think about if you have a limited budget. And you might even buy more than you actually need because you don't know how much you're going to need or how much you're going to want, and it's cheap, right? So we have what we call a downward sloping demand curve, that when the price is high, consumers don't want to spend a lot of resources on it. And when the price is low, you'll be able to sell more of it to the consumer. So that's the basic law of demand. But when an economist is talking about price, they're not just talking about the money price, they're talking about the full price. And the full price is the money price that you spend plus the value of the time that you spend consuming it. So for example, if you go to a movie, you buy a ticket, right? That's the money price. But the time price are the hours that you're sitting there in the movie house, and not including whatever commuting time or standing in line to buy the ticket. So the value of your time is an important consideration when you're deciding whether to go to a movie. And one of the advantages of streaming is that you don't have to spend that much time. You just have to spend the time watching it. The same is true if you buy a book. The book itself costs money, unless you borrow it from a library, but then you have to spend the time reading it. And that's your cost. It takes time away from other things. So when we're talking about religion, we want to think about not only what you have to spend in terms of money, but much more importantly, the time that you're spending. Now, what is the value of that time? Well, economists need to put a price on things. Well, you need to put a price on things just to make them commensurate. So the full price is the money value, let's say in dollars, plus the time price in dollars. And how do you evaluate the time price in dollars? Well, we have a simple rule of thumb that we use, and I don't want to go into a long explanation to prove to you that it's a good thing to use. Take it on faith, because we have a limited amount of time here, and I want to talk more about religion than I do about economics. So what we use as a rule of thumb is the wage rate, the hourly wage rate that you could be earning if you were working for that hour. And if you're not working by the hour, if you're paid by the month or the year, then you just sort of multiply it down and so that you get an average hourly wage rate. If you're not working for the market, if you're working for yourself or you're working in home production, we impute a wage rate to you. We call it the shadow wage. So everybody has a wage rate, which is the value of their time. So if you take the wage rate as a sort of a broad indicator, and also I should say that demand curves for individuals aren't what we're interested in. It's the demand curve for the market, the whole group of individuals that make up our consumer body. So, using the average wage rate in a country or in a city or in an occupation is generally good enough to measure the value of time for your consumer. Now, wage rates also have a different implication because they're related to your income. Usually, most people get their income by working, which means that the higher your wage rate, the more income you have. And the rule of thumb for demand theory is the more income you have, the more you can afford. You can afford to buy lots of things. And that works. But it doesn't work for your time, because it doesn't matter how much income you have and how many things you can afford to buy, you still only have 24 hours of time. So when we're talking about let's just keep that in mind for the moment. So that's the economic tools that we're going to need to talk about religion. Are there any questions? Are you all just stunned? Okay, now I'm going to talk about religion. Religion is a good. Well, actually, it's better to think of it as a bundle of several different goods. Three in particular are things that economists have studied. The first good is what we call the spiritual good. It's spirituality. And that's actually the good that defines this activity as religious. We're looking for a spiritual experience. So that's the first good. The second good is a social good. Religion is something that you do in a group. Now, even if you pray by yourself or your spiritual activity is your own personal activity, we still say you join a religion, you belong to a religion, you leave a religion. So you are identifying with a group of co-religionists. And we'll talk about that later. I'm not talking about socializing, meeting new friends, and that sort of thing, or showing off your jewels. I'm talking about the fact that religion is done makes you a part of a group. And then there is the afterlife good, which is the way in which religion helps us deal with the immensity of our own mortality by embedding it in a longer time span, perhaps with an afterlife, or perhaps in some other way, reincarnation. There's other ways of identifying, of achieving this goal, making you feel as though your life has meaning because it's part of something larger than you, larger than this time. So those are three goods. Now the third good, the afterlife good, I'm not going to talk about much because it's different for different religions. But basically, from an economic point of view, you're investing in something. Your religion will tell you something is good because it will improve your afterlife situation, and something is bad because it will make your afterlife situation unbearable. And so you have this incentive to do the things that are supposed to be good, not because you want to do them particularly, but because you're worried about you're concerned about what will happen to you after you die. The afterlife good is like an investment. in the future. It's an unknown future. It has probabilities associated with it. Uh, they tend to be things that young people don't think about, older people do. You're so busy as a young person investing in things that will affect your life here on earth. You're investing in an education, you're investing in a business, you're investing in a relationship with a spouse and children. So you're investing in a lot of things that you want to be able to enjoy the payoff before you die. So you generally postpone investments in the afterlife until a little bit later in life, which is one of the reasons we see people becoming more concerned about religious investments later in life. They are concerned about their own mortality once they get near the end. So that's all I want to say about the afterlife. The social good, the social good is belonging to a religion. People are not born into a religion. We say you're born into religion, but what we actually mean by that is that we're born into a family and a community that has that religion, but the baby doesn't have the religion. The baby has to be taught that religion. So part of parenting and part of the community's responsibility to its children is to teach them the religion and the appropriate behavior for members of that religion. And we call that religious human capital or religious education. You can be more or less skilled, more or less knowledgeable in this religion. And I'm whatever, but we'll be referring back to the notion of religious skills in a generic way later on. But belonging to the group that practices that religion is a very important aspect of what you experience when you buy the religious good. But the essence, and the one that I want to talk about the most, is spirituality. You belong to this group and you're happy with it if it helps you obtain the spiritual goals that you are seeking. And if you are not, if the group is not helping you in this, then you tend to be dissenting. You tend to complain about the group or feel that it's not worth your time and not worth your energy, because it's spirituality that is the basic fundamental nature of this religious good that we're making. Now, spirituality is not something you can buy. It's what we call a self-produced good. You can buy, there's a production process here. Now, when you're buying candles, let's say, you have a company that makes candles and it has a production process. It uses capital, it uses labor, uses raw materials, and it comes out with a candle, which it then sells and presumably makes a profit, but not always. And you can buy those candles that somebody else has made. But you may think that you need them or you want them for religious experience, but that has nothing to do with the candle maker. The candle maker is making candles for all kinds of experiences, romantic experiences, generating light, decoration, whatever. But you want your candle for a religious experience. So you buy the candle, and that's a money outlay. But it's not really, it doesn't give you anything spiritually unless you use it in a particular context. The religion that you belong to gives you a recipe. How can you use that candle in order to get a religious experience? You light it at a certain time. You light it in a certain place. You say a blessing over it. You think certain thoughts when you light it. So this is like a recipe, which is a production process, because what you're producing is spirituality. So it takes your time and the production recipe in order to transform this candle into a religious object, but then you have to use it in order to get a spiritual experience. and to get that kind of spiritual satisfaction. And that's what we call self-produced. We have a number of goods in our lives that are self-produced, that you don't buy off the shelf. You have to make them yourself. An artistic expression is in the same way. You buy materials, but you have to use them in a certain way in order to get the satisfaction of your expression. Your children are in that. Your children take a lot of money, but they take a lot of time also, and you have to be engaged in the parenting experience in order to get the the uh, the pleasure and the experience of parenting and nurturing the next generation. So these are all examples of self-produced goods that we know a fair amount about, and we just apply that uh, method to looking at religion as a self-produced good. Now, what these self-produced goods all have in common is that they're very time intensive. The fact that you can't buy it, you can only buy inputs, but you have to make it, means that a large part of the cost of this production is time. And we're going to focus on time because everybody pays the same thing when they buy a candle, but not everybody pays the same thing when they devote this candle to a religious outcome because people have different wage rates. The value of time is different for different people. Everybody has the same amount of time, but its value is different for different people. And what's really interesting to an economist is to look to see how a change in the wage rate explains changes in the way people observe their religion. Even if they don't change their religion, they observe it differently. One way to think of this is that your wage, a young person's wage, is generally lower than it will be as they mature and grow older and get experience in the workforce. So there are life cycle differences in the way people observe their religion. Another way of thinking of it, another application, is immigration. If you're immigrating from a low wage area to a high wage area, and that can be from rural village to an urban city, or it can be from a low wage, less developed country to a high wage, more developed country, uh, or it can be staying in the same place if your country is less developed and becomes a more developed country because its economic development processes are occurring. Each of those is an example of how a person's wage rate can change. And then we can think about what would be the implications of this for your budgeting decisions. Now, one implication, let's say a life cycle implication, is that when you're young, you tend to do a lot of time intensive things. And as you get older and you go up your occupational gradient and earn higher wages, your time becomes more valuable. And so you are less interested in time intensive activities. And you tend to spend money on things that will save time, whether it's a housekeeper that lets you off your domestic chores, or a child care provider that takes care of the children, uh, uh, restaurant meals so that you don't have to cook for your family, uh, various ways in which we save time by spending money. And for an economist, that's a trade-off between time and money. It has to do with relative prices. When your wage is low, you budget more time-intensive goods. And when your wage is high, you budget more money-intensive goods. Right? To me, that's second nature. Now, when I don't know if that sounds a little strange or unfamiliar to you, but I'm sure in your life, you've seen your parents, you've seen your friends, and you've experienced yourself that you see these things happening. The what happens to religion when the wage goes up? Well, time-intensive religious practices appeal more to low-wage people than they do to high-wage people. Not because the low-wage people are more religious, but because the high-wage people change the way in which they're religious. They buy more goods. They'll make donations in money, but not so much volunteer for time. That's one difference. Doesn't mean they're less religious. It just means their budgets are different. Uh, the services, churches. I'm using churches here in the generic sense, including any, mosques, synagogues, temples, whatever. So the literature is generally uh, deals with people studying religion in the United States and in Europe, and they use churches. So that's just the term that we use. But it has to do with religious institutions, church services. Right? Some churches have very long services, 4 or 5 hours on a Sunday. Other churches have long hours spread out over many days or different times of day when you're supposed to engage in communal prayer services or sermons or some other collective activity. But high wage people don't want to spend that much time in services, not only because they could be working, but because their higher incomes will give them all kinds of other opportunities. They could be they could be dancing, they could be sailing, they can be spending time with their family in non-religious pursuits. So higher incomes give you many more opportunities for how to spend your time. Uh, then religion has to compete with that. So some churches uh, don't change their beliefs, they don't change their denomination, but they change their practices. They just make the services shorter. Uh, you can have a church that has a 4 hour service and a church that has a 2 hour service. And you would expect to find that the higher wage people in high wage occupations or high wage communities, prefer the 2 hour service to the 4 hour service. And it's not because they're less religious, they're differently religious. They're adapting to new budgetary circumstances. Another way you can adapt, which happens to be one that I find a little bit amusing, uh, they come late to services. If it's a 4 hour service, you're not there right at the beginning. You show up 2 hours into the service and you sit at the back of the room. And that way you get a 2 hour service and it satisfies your sense of belonging to the group, but you don't have to spend the time. Now, what's more, the reason why people prefer the churches with the 2 hour service is that everybody has a shorter time. And so what you're concerned about is how you're spending that time. What we call quality time when we're talking about our children. If you only spend 2 hours a day with your children, you want it to be quality time. So we have quality time for religious services. Now, what does that mean? Well, think about one possibility. One possibility is that people in high wage occupations are educated people. They have technical specialties. Uh, they are used to feeling competent in their world of work because they have an expertise in their field. And when they come to their religious life, they don't feel competent at all unless they know something. They want to know something about the religion, about the ritual, about the history. They don't want to just do things by rote. They want to know, they want to think. And they want to learn from the clergy who are leading the service. They want to learn about their religion. They want to learn how to apply their religion to their everyday life. They are looking to the clergy as technical experts in spirituality and how to make it. So the nature of the service changes as it gets shorter. Now, another way the nature of the services change A lot of religion help you get a spiritual experience by repeating a mantra. But you learn something by rote, and then you repeat it over and over and over again. And that way, it transports you into another world. You're not thinking with your cognitive brain, you're thinking with another part of your brain, and it helps you achieve that level of spirituality. Now, if you're having a 4-hour service or even a 6-hour service, that'll work. But if you're only having a service that lasts for 1 or 2 hours, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work because you're not giving yourself enough time to achieve that level of otherness. So what does work if you're having a shorter service is something that involves your intellect, something that involves your philosophical thinking capabilities. So you can learn about the history of your religion, you can learn about the theology, and get to your spiritual experience in a very different way. So what we find is that those religions that rely on mantras and and there is one other way in which you can do this. You can repeat prayers so that the ritual in a 2-hour service can involve repetition of the same prayers every day, but not as a mantra, but as something that you can think about, as something that it may be in another language, but you need to understand the other language to know what you're talking about. And people feel the need to understand. They call that in America, which is a good example of a high-wage country, they call it meaningfulness. You want the service to be meaningful. And it's not clear that just repeating by rote is meaningful. Now, in my generation, meaningfulness is a very important part of what a religious seeker is looking for. But if I'd said that to my grandmother and said, I want a service that's meaningful, she'd look at me mystified. Whatever did I mean by that? Services are spiritual, they're not meaningful. But meaningful is what we use to describe a spiritual experience of a different type. And high-wage countries are generally countries where religions are looking for meaningful services rather than time-intensive services. Most of the ways in which this has been studied in the United States and has been in the context of what the sociologists call immigrant religions. Immigrants come to this, it's a country of immigrants. And the immigrants that are the most studied in this literature are the ones that came to the United States in 1900, plus or minus a couple of decades, because that was the era of mass immigration. But immigrants have come to the United States starting in the 1600s. Well, the United States wasn't the United States then, but nevertheless, they came seeking religious freedom. That's because the countries from which they came had a state religion, which is a religious monopoly for one particular religion. A state religion, the government confers a monopoly on a particular religion, and it enforces that monopoly more or less enthusiastically. So that's the country's religion. You have a Christian country with a state religion of Christianity, and if you're not a Christian, you're a dissenter. Actually, in Europe, it was the Catholic Church that was the monopoly for centuries, from the Middle Ages throughout the Renaissance. But people who didn't get satisfaction spiritually from the church and from belonging to the church rebelled and formed the Protestant Revolution. And Protestants in a Catholic country were called dissenters. Adam Smith, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is the beginning of modern economics, and he wrote this in 1776, he talks about religion and the difference between the religious establishment, which was the monopoly, the state religion, Church of England, and the dissenters, who were the Protestants. Now, Catholics and Protestants were very cruel to each other at the beginning of this Reformation. The Catholics viewed the Protestants as heretics and persecuted them. And then when Protestantism grew strong enough to become its own state religion in some countries, then they persecuted the Catholics the same way. So there was not a whole lot of religious tolerance. Usually when you're talking about a monopoly in the economics world, there are always competitors that want to come in and destroy your turf. And the way a monopoly deals with this, first of all, it says, well, the competition gives you an inferior product. And we see that in the religious establishments as well. Dealing with competition with dissenters, they say, well, it's an inferior product. It's not real Islam. It's not real Christianity. It's not real Judaism. It's just watered down. So that's one way they deal with it. When the dissenters are a small, relatively weak group, they shrug it off with this kind of talk. If the dissenters become stronger and begin to attract more adherents, then they begin to enforce their monopoly. And the monopoly gets enforced by the government, which gives the monopoly power, and it results in religious persecution. Sometimes it's of a mild sort. You just have trouble finding certain jobs or working in certain industries like the government. Sometimes it gets a real rough and it becomes deathly. But generally speaking, that only happens if the religious dissenters are strong enough to attract people. And that means that they have something to offer that the established church isn't offering. That's when you get religious dissenters emigrating and going to a country where they can practice their own religion. Either a country where the religious monopoly, state religion, is their own, or a place like the United States, which is a country of religious pluralism, which has no state religion. We say United States is a Christian country, but it is not in the sense that the government is going to come to the aid of the church. So there are many, many religious dissenters. Well, you can't be a dissenter if there's no state religion. There are many different religions, people who have immigrated to the United States specifically for the right to practice their own religion. And many of them are very insular, small communities like the Amish or the Mennonites, or I'm trying to think of some others. They tend to be small. They build a wall around themselves, and they can persist. The Mormons were such a religion until they became a strong religion. The Methodists were dissenters in England who came to America and then attracted enough people so they are now considered mainline Protestants. So there's that process. But many people who are leaving a state religion to come to America are not coming for religious reasons. They're coming for economic reasons. They're coming in order to earn higher wages. And when they arrive in America, they may have co-religionists. They are used to a low-wage religious practice, and they come to America and they find that their co-religionists in America are using high-wage religious practices. They don't always understand this right away. First of all, they feel uncomfortable, so they tend to form the ethnic churches, the immigrant churches, they're called. They're communities of immigrants who come from the same country with the same religion. They speak the same language. They have the same religious practices that they had in the old country. And the people who've come there earlier can help the newcomers. And it's a very comfortable, safe haven in a world that's very confusing. requires a lot of adjustment. Once they learn English, once they get adjusted to the consumption patterns and the uh, labor force in the new country, and they begin to find jobs that are not just low-wage immigrant jobs, but jobs with a future where they can improve their income, then they are beginning to adjust and adapt to American consumption patterns. So, what seemed to be materialistic to the new immigrants now makes sense. They can afford to buy a car so that they can get to a job that's a better job. They can afford to move into a different neighborhood so that their housing situation improves, the education prospects for their children improves, uh, and their church experience will become the church in the new neighborhood, which is made up of people like them in middle wage occupations who are, have discovered techniques for enhancing the experience of a less time intensive process. So these are called ethnic churches sometimes, or they are called American churches. To the newcomer and to the foreigners, they say they're materialistic. But in fact, they substitute goods for time in order to acquire a spiritual experience within the same religious theology. And as incomes improve and the immigrants become so absorbed into the American economy that they become high wage uh, and they move into the suburbs or new neighborhoods, better housing, better schooling, and they can afford to spend more money. They have more opportunities to do a lot of things, and religion has to compete with them, and they join churches that are less demanding on time. They donate money to churches. Now, one of the other characteristics of the pluralism in America is because there's no state religion, uh, there's the church itself, the congregation itself, is not an efficient way of providing for what we call para-religious activities, care for the widows and orphans, care for the sick, hospitals, special foods, perhaps, special garments, educational materials for the religious schools. That's really something that the community as a whole shares. It's not efficient to do it one church at a time, one congregation at a time. So we have what we call the para-religious institutions. Para-religious institutions are educational, that are associated with a particular religion, religious schools, religious uh, homes for the aged, child care, uh, hospitals, nursing homes. These are all institutions that are associated in a country with a state religion. The state religion takes care of all of these things. But in America, we have separate institutions that are called religious, but are not involved in spiritual activities, but rather in these other activities that the community needs, that the community supports because it enhances their spirituality, but they're not actually religious, so to speak. And you often find people who cross over. People in the Catholic who benefit from Catholic charities are not all Catholic. People who benefit from from the Jewish hospitals are not all, and nursing homes are not all Jewish. But then we have another set of institutions in a pluralistic society that we call umbrella organizations. An umbrella organization is an organization that's not made up of individuals, but rather of congregations. So you have the National Council of Churches for the Protestants, and you have the United Synagogues of America for the Jews. These are serving the interests of the religious congregations that are not efficient to serve that are more efficient to serve collectively than individually. An example is the development of educational materials for religious schools, publishing prayer books for the services of the religious congregations, lobbying the government in terms for the political aspects of religious interests. These are all things done by the umbrella organizations that have no counterpart in a country with a state religion. And that's all part of the American way. The umbrella organizations are not themselves religious, but they serve religious interests of a particular group. The same thing is true of the para-religious organizations. Neither of them is governed by theology per se, the way the churches are, but they are serving the interests of the religious community. When you come as an immigrant from a country with a state religion to a country like the United States that has immigrant churches or individual churches, you have to adjust to that transition of not assuming that your congregation, clergy, is going to take care of everything for you. You need to be supportive of these other charities, and that's one of the ways in which your money goes. So you're substituting time for money, and the money is going into para-religious organizations and umbrella organizations in addition to your own church. I'm trying to think of something else that is really important for
Carmel,
my time.
sorry to interrupt. Yes, and there are some questions.
Yeah.
So, what should we do?
Questions, because there are lots of other things we could talk about.
Yeah.
But I want to know what you're thinking about.
Fantastic. Okay, so perfect. Let's do that. So let's start with Chloe.
And I just said that I can go last because there's some other questions that I think are interesting. So.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Chloe. Then let's go with Kayla.
For me, you'll have to speak more slowly.
Okay. Kayla, please.
I was just curious if there's any other metrics associated with time investment other than hourly wage.
And then, oh yeah, and then if there were any associated with energy. And then just to
what was the second question?
Oh, if there's any associated with energy.
Energy. Well, that was the wage. There are lots of things associated with the value of time other than the wage. The wage is a first approximation, and all those other things we call the shadow wage, because that's the terminology that economists are used to. Let's suppose you're a student and you're very low wage, but you also have to study, and that takes time. And the study time is probably more important than your actual work time, because the study time is going to affect your future and your future earning power. So we use that notion to think of studying as an investment that you're making, and the way other investments are measured, you can impute the value of your time for an hour of studying from how much is it going to raise your wage rate, not only in 1 year or 1 hour, but for every hour in your future. So there are techniques for dealing with that. So that's when you're a student, you have a shadow wage. And student doesn't have to be in school. A student can be an artist who's beginning to experiment with different forms of art until they find their métier that they're best at. And they're experimenting with what can they produce that people will want to buy. And so they will eventually find themselves, they'll find what they do best, they find what they like the most, they find what people are willing to pay the most for, and they will settle into a trajectory where they're earning money. So the value of that experimental period is much higher than what you're actually earning during that experimental period. It's the value of what it's going to yield in the future in terms of not only a higher income in one year, but for every year after that. So, and people are always changing, so they're always making these investments. But that's one example of what we use for a shadow wage. Another way is if you're a homemaker and you're raising children, and that's the main it's your non-market time, but your children are investment, they have value. The things you do for them have value, and the value of a housewife's time, there are different ways of estimating it. My favorite personally is the value of her husband's wage, because you're engaged in a household activity where you're trading off between the time you spend and the time your husband spends. And at the margin, they should, if it's sufficient, they should be the same. So that's another sort of leap of logic that I'm asking you to make, but we can talk about that at another time if you like. But there are various ways we have of estimating the value of time other than the actual present wage, and we just call them the shadow wage. I don't remember your second question. I didn't write it down.
That's okay. Thank you. That covers it.
That what? I don't hear you.
That covers it. That covered both questions.
Okay. Next question.
Okay, perfect. So we go with Karen Martini.
Like, I think you already talked a bit about it, but I am still a bit in doubt about what makes it interesting for a religion.
Say that more slowly, please.
Oh, sure.
My soundboard is not that great, so.
I'm curious to understand better what makes it interesting for a religion to dictate other areas of people's lives, such as politics, sexuality, moral values, in terms of what goods does it bring back, both to people and for the institution of religion.
I'm sorry, was that a question?
Yes.
Or was that a comment? Okay, what was the question part?
No,
I'm sorry. Are you asking how religions adapt to technology or use technology?
No, what makes it interesting for a religion to have moral guides and to get involved in politics?
Oh, what makes it interesting for religion to get involved? Well, you know, there's a trap that we all sometimes fall into, thinking everybody ought to be like ourselves. And some religions actually teach that those are the missionary religions that say, you ought to be like us or else you're losing out on an important afterlife experience or something else. And they try and impose that on other people through laws. Religious theologies vary a lot, especially when it comes to practical teachings about everyday life. And when one religion tries to impose its religious values by making a law, what they're doing is they're taking the first step towards making a monopoly out of their religion and using the government to punish people who don't follow their religious rules. And that happens a lot in every country. Religious leaders always seem to think that's part of their job. And people in other religions who don't agree with these laws need to lobby against their adoption in order to protect their own religious beliefs. So that's what, in the United States, that's what happens most of the time. And there are jokes about this. Sort of, they think they're the only ones here. They think they're a monopoly. They think they are real Americans. But of course, everybody's a real American, regardless of their religion. And we've had a lot of that has surfaced lately in American politics. And the religious or umbrella organizations are the leaders in resisting it. and presenting other points of view. So that's the way they get into politics.
Excellent.
That's really, ideally, that's the only way they get into politics. But there are always some religious groups that think their way is best and they need to impose it by law.
Okay, I'm not sure if Amir Mohammed, do you still want to ask, or you're okay with the previous answer?
With the first part, yeah, but maybe if we have time,
I'm not
ask
hearing
my
you very
second
well because you're
question.
not coming through. Can you speak slower and louder?
Yeah, sure. So I just have this question. I would like to know if you have any explanation for Iran's revolution. You know, while the economy was getting better as a result of selling oil, the people turned away from money and moved toward religion.
You're talking about when the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah was deposed.
Yes, yes.
That's a good example of the value of time. When the country is developing economically and has more opportunities in the labor market and people's wages are improving and more people are moving into high wage occupations, there's an incentive for them to adapt their religious practices to their new lives, their new opportunity. And it's not just the value of their time, it's also their human capital, their education. When you are educated in one area, it affects your ability to become educated in other areas. So the practice of Islam was changing, and in particular, it changes away from viewing the clergy as your only source of information. You can get information about your religion. Well, now it's from the internet, but from books, from studying the Quran yourself, not by rote, but with scholarship, with philosophy. So these things are happening in a country that is becoming economically developed and technologically more sophisticated. Now, who doesn't like this the most are the traditional imams and the traditional religious monopoly, which is a hierarchy with a lot of political power. And so what do? Well, in Iran's case, they organized the low-wage people from the rural areas to come into the cities and support the imams' grasp on traditional power. And they won. I mean, I think that the defenses against that were very weak, because while the more educated people felt that they were stronger in the economy, but they felt that they were weaker in the religion. And they were vulnerable to the accusation that they were materialistic and not religious. And it's really important to understand that religions change over time with the economic circumstances of the people, that you're not weaker and materialistic in the sense of because you're substituting good for time, because you're still working on spirituality. You're still trying to make a spiritual experience that's meaningful to you in your new economic circumstances and your new educational circumstances. That's a problem that we have all over. I mean, Europe was torn apart for centuries by the Protestant Revolution. For the same issue, the same issue. The Catholic Church is torn apart until Vatican II tried to make some adaptation to the American Catholic Church, which was so different from the traditional one. And then the backlash comes from Africa. The African church has not made that transition and is not interested in that. So there are different ways of being Catholic. There are different ways of being Muslim. There are different ways of being Jewish. And the essence is in the theology, not in your everyday practices.